Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Bob Mendelsohn, and this is the Bob's Your Uncle podcast. Welcome to Season 4, Episode 5. Today featuring Dr. Deborah Fuller from the University of Washington, a virologist talking about vaccines and the big question, whom do you trust? Stay tuned. You can now find us and comment to us wherever you get your podcasts. Tell us what matters to you, what triggers your joy, what bothers you in the world. Let us know. We'll see where the Spirit leads us. Wherever you are just now, whether you're out for your evening constitutional, or you're here in Australia, or back in the United States with friends, or all by yourself with your headset on, hey, wherever you are, thanks for joining us these 18 minutes. Of note, the opinions are strictly my own and those of my guests.
But I do know that I love you, and I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world this would be.
On this date in history, the 17th of October, in 1854, the British and French troops began the siege of Sebastopol during the Crimean War. In 1867, after much opposition, a deal negotiated by U.S. Secretary of State William Seward for the U.S. purchase of the Russian colony of Alaska was approved, and on this day the U.S. flag was flown over the capital, Sitka. In 1956, the world's first industrial-scale commercial nuclear power plant was opened by Queen Elizabeth II in the UK. Finally, in aviation history, in 1913, in the worst air disaster up to that date, German zeppelin L-2 exploded in midair, 600 feet over the city of Johannesthal, Germany, killing all 28 passengers and crew on board, and that's the historical marker of the week. Thanks for joining me today, Dr. Deborah Fuller, Professor of Microbiology at the University of Washington, Associate Director of Research at the Washington National Primate Research Center, Director of Virology and Immunology Core. My, oh my, this is lots of titles. Thanks for being with us today on the Bob's Your Uncle podcast. I have so many questions to ask you. Can you help my audience to understand this world of science? First, virology. What is that, and how did that specialized sector of medicine and research get your attention?
Yeah, so virology is just really the study of viruses, and viruses on two different levels. Generally, people study the basic virus itself. How does it replicate? How does it function? What are viruses? Where are they? And then the other piece, and this is the half that I really focus on, is like when a virus gets into the body, how does that body respond to the virus? And how does that in turn impact our ability to either resist viruses or for viruses to win the war against our bodies and cause disease? So, and of course, my area of research in that sort of pivot is about vaccines and antivirals. So I'm going to always try to think of ways that I can give the body an advantage over the virus in this sort of arms race between virus versus body.
That's a great way to call it. Hey, so many people thought, and dare I say, still think that viruses are political ploys by governments, and especially some folks who are interested in dismissing the government. Are there really such things as global viruses that are capable of massive pain and suffering?
You know, first of all, viruses are not political, all right? So they infect anybody, the warm body. They don't care about where you're from. They don't recognize borders. They don't care what your race is. They will infect people and they will cause widespread disease if they can. So there is always still, you know, a concern among scientists like myself and many others in my field of preparing for possible future pandemics like the one we experienced with COVID. And, you know, in fact, before COVID hit, I was, my lab and many other labs were funded to develop strategies to quickly respond to an emerging pandemic. We thought the next one was going to be flu because we've always had flu pandemics, but there's a history of flu pandemics. The 1918 flu pandemic is a really good example. It was one of the worst pandemics by a virus ever, killing, you know, over 500 million people. And, you know, and it was just devastating. So, but there have been other pandemics. And so when COVID hit, one of the reasons why we were so able to respond so quickly isn't because there was some sort of politics going on or some hocus pocus or anything. It really was because as scientists, we were anticipating this might happen, and we were prepared with this new technology called RNA vaccines to quickly respond to them. But, you know, a lot of people think RNA vaccines are, you know, part of another government thing or something, and that they were developed too fast. And so there must be something, you know, fishy about them. But the reality is that, you know, myself and many of my other colleagues who work in this domain, you know, we started with this concept over 30 years ago, and there had already been clinical trials of RNA vaccines for influenza and other sorts of diseases. So when COVID hit, it was just really easy to pivot and quickly plug and play and rapidly respond to this pandemic. And thankfully, because prior to RNA vaccines, it would have taken typically 4 years, was the fastest vaccine ever developed. And this one was developed much quicker and saved millions and millions of lives.
And it was global. I think one of the things that surprised me, I was living here in Australia, but I kept watching global news. And one of the things in the US that surprised me in 2017, then President Trump withdrew the United States from UNESCO. And in July 2020, President Trump announced the US would withdraw from the World Health Organization due to its being what he called China-centric. How damaging were those unprecedented withdrawals vis-a-vis the pandemic or continuing health in America?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things I teach a class in vaccines, and I remember presenting to my students in the past year. Imagine that you are heading up, you know, either in politics or science or whatever. What would you have done differently? And I think one of the big things that we should have learned, and hopefully we'll learn about this pandemic to prepare for the next one, is that you can't isolate yourself. You know, when as I said, viruses, they don't recognize borders. They're going to spread all over, and they are going to cause disease everywhere. And we need to cooperate, and we need to save as many people as possible. One of the things that I think was promising, you know, while there were political, you know, issues and governments, you know, sort of, you know, pushing and pulling on this subject. One of the interesting things is that the scientists really kind of got together and globally. And a very unusual thing that hadn't really happened before is that generally with science, when we kind of discover something new or we, you know, have a new finding in our lab, we take our time and we publish it. We kind of keep things close to our chest because we don't want somebody to scoop us, you know, or something like that. But, you know, scientists recognize that, you know, with the pandemic, that this wasn't going to work, that we really had to share our ideas and our discoveries in real time. So, for example, it was really a Chinese scientist who actually just published the sequence for the virus on a social media site, you know, not through traditional methods. And by doing that, that enabled, you know, scientists worldwide to very quickly develop a diagnostic, so that we could determine who was infected and not infected, and had a huge impact in being able to track the disease. And then that sequence was absolutely essential to design a vaccine. So, this sort of sharing among scientists was something that was somewhat unprecedented, and it just showed what is possible when people get together and, break down the barriers, that exist.
Earlier this month, Katalin Karikó and Drew Weissman shared the Nobel Prize for Medicine. The old expression in detective work to find a criminal was always follow the money. How does a research team like Karikó and Weissman, who led in the development of vaccines, especially in the pandemic, how do they stay above the fray of tainted research? That is, how do they avoid fact readjustment to gain the funding they require? How does any honest researcher avoid the pitfall of accommodation to the funders?
Yeah. What a great question. One of the things, if we trace back in the history of, and I call it globally nucleic acid vaccines, which includes RNA vaccines and DNA vaccines that I worked on. If you look back in the history of how RNA vaccines got started, and DNA vaccines as well, is when we first came up with the concept over 30 years ago, and and Drew and Karikó working on this as well. There was a lot of skepticism among the scientists in the field, and we all had difficulty in getting funding to support what seems like an idea that is new and innovative, but not yet tried and true. So there's always that sort of that game that you play. You got a new idea, but you have to first and foremost convince your peers that it's something worth pursuing, because it's your peers actually that, when you submit grant applications to get your work funded, are going to review your grants. And if they're just like, oh well, this is just too outrageous, or maybe it's a nice little trick, but it will never really work in people. Those literally are the things that people said at the beginning. And really what comes to it is that scientists, when we're trained in something, is that we constantly pursue our curiosity, right? And so that stands apart from the funding and the like. And so we're in the lab and we discover something interesting and exciting that we think could potentially, lead to a new piece of information or a new intervention to protect against a disease. We pursue it obsessively, and often people would ask me, for example, well, do you actually believe your thing will work? And I said, well, if I don't believe it, who will? Because I'm the one working on it. So there's a lesson there that that scientists should, when they believe in something and really are committed to their ideas, that they stick with it. But there's the other piece where, to be able to stick with things, you do need funding, right? And a lot of times, people. I worked in both biotech and academia, and at one point, somebody said, well, in academia, you got more freedom to work on whatever you want. And I said, sure, freedom to work on whatever you want, as long as you can get funding for it. So there is that piece. And so we do play the funding game. A lot of, our funding in academia is funded through like the National Institute of Health and other funding organizations. And there is really a process where you submit the grant application, and as I mentioned, it gets peer reviewed and evaluated for the integrity of the science. And then there's sort of what they call pay line, that if you score really, really, really well, and we're talking like in the top 1 to 10% of all grants, then you might get that funded. So, but the feedback then you get from your peers, you can kind of incorporate and try to resubmit it. And sometimes we can go, 1, 2, 3 years of resubmitting our ideas over and over before we actually see the funding. So, and that's in academia, but that's also in the private sector. In that case, they're more interested in, they have a product, they have to come up with a product. And so you have to center your concepts around, a potential product. So you're always playing this sort of funding game, but alongside of that is always this sort of determination of the scientist not to give up. Okay. If you believe in what you're doing, Don't get discouraged if you don't get the funding for it right away. Just keep at it and keep working at generating. Sometimes you get pilot funding, little small amounts here and there to generate additional data that continues to support your idea until suddenly there's a pivot point and you just get the funding to be able to do that. That's what Drew and Carrico did. They stuck with it even against the naysayers, and look what we have today. We have an mRNA vaccine for COVID.
I'm going to leave this right there. I'm going to put my finger on the tape, and next week you'll hear the second part of a 2-part interview with Dr. Deborah Fuller from the University of Washington. She was the go-to person on Bloomberg television during the pandemic, an amazing woman that my wife and I met when we were in Turkey. So come back next week. Don't miss part 2 of this excellent interview. What do you think about all this? Why don't you write me, bobmendo@aol.com, or comment on an Instagram or TikTok to me. I'd love to know what you're thinking. You know that the world has watched Israel, Hamas, this last 10 days or so with great grief. Some are boasting about the murders and brutality of desecrating human life, children, babies, grandparents. It's horrible to watch. I don't know how you're responding, but I'm feeling great grief. And even if someone goes in and blasts another rocket and wins a war, what cost? It's just painful to watch. Feel free to write me and let's communicate together about this. Every week we read a passage from the bestseller, the #1 bestseller of all time, the Bible, and today's no different. From Micah chapter 7 we read, "Do not trust in a neighbor, do not have confidence in a friend. From her who lies in your bosom, guard your lips." Don't forget to come back next week to hear part 2 of Dr. Fuller's interview. Until then, from me, Bob Mendelsohn, when things seem bleak or uncertain, look up to God. He's in his heaven, and Bob's your uncle. Shalom from Sydney.